Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. How's everybody been, especially with this past holiday weekend? I hope everybody had a wonderful time with your family and friends, shooting off fireworks, grilling out, or swimming, or whatever else you may be doing with your loved ones. It was a really good time this year to go shoot fireworks on our nation's birthday. Which, fun fact, that just happens to be my birthday too. So, happy birthday not only to our wonderful country, but to myself as well. Anyway, I am excited to get back in the seat of history with you guys. And as you'll recall last time, we talked about the most decorated United States Army general in history. And that particular honor went to none other than General Douglas MacArthur, who was originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, I know a lot of people may or may not recognize the name and who he was, but to dumb it down a little bit in case you did not tune into the last episode, General MacArthur served for over 50 years active duty in the U.S. Army and served in a number of smaller as well as larger conflicts all over the world. In fact, when he first became an officer around the turn of the 20th century, he was actually deployed to the Philippines during the later part of the Philippine insurrection around the turn of the century through the early 1900s. But then he would return stateside and would actually participate in a little bit of the Mexican Revolution with the landing at Veracruz. That was pretty exciting. But then, fast forward a little bit, he actually participated in numerous American battles during World War I and even commanded the famous 42nd Infantry Division, as well as the 84th Infantry Division during all the different stages of World War I. And he was actually decorated several times for his valor and leadership during the war. Now, fast forward a little bit, he continued to serve in the Army. In fact, he made a career out of it and would go on to be the commander of U.S. Army forces in the Philippines, or the Far East as they like to call it, where he basically commanded all Army troops around the Philippines and New Georgia, New Guinea, Australia, all those little tiny islands just south and east of China, Vietnam, almost leading up to Japan. Well, it was during one of those initial operations, the original First Battle of the Philippines in December 1941 through the first part of 1942, that he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for essentially organizing the full-scale retreat of American forces from the Philippines just as the Japanese were invading and trying to take over. He was in a lot of danger during this whole time, and in fact, he was out in the field with all of his men to coordinate attacks and to make sure that everybody got out safely. He was basically the brains behind this whole operation, and it was due to these actions in the Philippine campaign that he would ultimately become, toward the end of the war, the commander of all U.S. Army forces in the Pacific Theater, period. Well, after World War II ends, he is in charge of the occupation of Japan, and then 5 years later, whenever the Korean War breaks out in June of 1950, he's called to service again. But this time, he serves not only as a commander for all U.S. forces, he is ruled the supreme commander of all UN and U.S. forces to Korea to combat the North Koreans and everything. Long story short, he had a lasting legacy on not only individuals and veterans of the U.S. Army, but all service members in general. In fact, if you'll take a moment to review all of his military awards and decorations. In addition to the Medal of Honor, he was awarded the U.S. military's second highest military award for valor 3 times. For the Army, that would be the Distinguished Service Cross. And for his service in World War I, he would also be awarded the Silver Star Medal, which is considered the 3rd highest military honor for valor, 7 times for serving in the trenches of World War I, among many, many other decorations. Officials have estimated that he has close to 100 medals to his name in total. That's pretty impressive, you guys. So anyway, why he is so important to today's episode is because he served as the supreme commander of all combat forces like UN and Allied forces during the Korean War, which over the next handful of episodes is going to be the main focus of our episodes. And I want to take the time to not only focus on the most decorated individuals to ever serve in the Korean War of the early 1950s, but also to tell you a little bit of backstory and other interesting things that you may not have known from school or history class or whatever. So today I want to kick this off by talking about the most decorated U.S. Army soldier to ever serve in the Korean War. Now, hold on. Before I go into the story behind this particular individual, let me give you a little bit of backstory about the Korean conflict that we're going to be covering in great detail. Now, essentially, the Korean War started on June 25th, 1950, whenever North Korea invaded South Korea in an attempt to unify the whole Korean peninsula under one communist government. Well, the war practically almost ended before it really got started, because starting in June of 1950, really all the way up until September 1950, the North Korean forces were almost unstoppable in everything. That was until the United States, aided by mainly U.S. military personnel, stepped in to aid the South Koreans against the North Korean onslaught and adversaries. Now, with a lot of training and a lot of behind-the-scenes operations, the later half of 1950 actually was a turning point to where the UN and US forces were able to push back the North Koreans almost all the way up into China. Well, whenever that happens, China comes to the aid of North Korea to basically give them an upper hand, per se, which in December of 1950 ultimately caused all UN forces, including elements of both the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, to retreat from the area called the Chosin Reservoir. Ultimately, the Marines and the soldiers decided to retreat because of the overwhelming number of Chinese forces and closing in on their perimeter. And that's pretty much the most excitement that goes on during the Korean War. For the next 2.5 years, the war basically turns into a stalemate where neither side is able to gain any territory whatsoever. In fact, it's mostly just a bunch of skirmishes. And the fact that all these lines aren't being moved, it turned the Korean War into looking like almost a World War I battlefield with a lot of trenches dug on either side and foxholes and all that stuff. In fact, there was a lot of more bloodshed from 1951 until July of 1953 before there was an armistice that was signed that officially ended hostilities. Well, as you know, North Korea and South Korea are still divided to this day. So the main reason I wanted to start this series is because a lot of people hear about World War II. They hear about Vietnam in the 1960s, but they never hear about the Korean War, which is officially the first armed conflict of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is where America really stepped in to try to halt the spread of communism in Asia as best as they could. And in all honesty, they actually did pretty good. They kept it fairly contained. So anyway, it's called the Forgotten War because Korea started only 5 years after World War II ended in 1950. And surprisingly, a lot of World War II veterans would go on to serve in Korea as well. I mean, a lot of them are practically from the same generation, and they used a lot of the exact same equipment that World War II veterans used, whether they were in the Pacific or Europe and what have you. So anyway, in my humble opinion, the Korean War is kind of an underrated conflict that I feel like people need to pay a little bit more attention to. Yeah, it's not as significant as a world war or some of the most recent conflicts or whatever, but it's still very important in modern history, and I think it deserves a little bit of more recognition than what we give it credit for. So anyway, with all that being said, I'm happy today to start out our Korean War mini-series with the most decorated U.S. Army veteran to serve on the front lines during the Korean War. I figured it's only appropriate because we just talked about the most decorated U.S. Army general of all time. Now let's transition to the most decorated U.S. Army Korean War veteran. So, without further ado or delay, that particular honor goes to none other than Lewis Lee Millet Sr., where as a captain during the Korean War, he would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for leading the last known major American bayonet charge in U.S. history. That's right, all the way up through World War II, Korea, much of the 1900s, we were still using bayonet tactics all the way from the Civil War and even older conflicts. It was still very much a thing even in Korea. Anyway, Lewis Millet Sr. was born on December 15th, 1920 in Mechanic Falls, Maine. He actually would move down to South Dartmouth, Massachusetts with his mother after his mom and dad divorced and his mother remarried to another man. Now, growing up in the Northeast like he did, he witnessed a lot of veterans from many different conflicts, including some of them like Civil War, the Indian Wars, the Philippine-American and Spanish-American Wars, World War I, of course. In fact, he actually had a lot of military history in his family. Records actually show that he had a grandfather that actually served on the side of the Union during that Civil War. And then he also had an uncle who served during World War I with the 101st Field Artillery Regiment, which was part of the Massachusetts Army National Guard. Now, Lewis was he was extremely close to that particular uncle who served in World War I and was actually fascinated by all the stories that he would tell him from a very young age. In fact, that actually influenced his decision to enlist in the military at a young age, too. In fact, while he was still attending high school in Dartmouth, Lewis actually enlisted in the Massachusetts National Guard as early as 1938, where ironically he would join his uncle's old regiment, the 101st Field Artillery. So he stays in the National Guard for a couple of years, getting himself trained up and getting ready to go to war. Because unlike a lot of Americans at this time, he could see it coming. He knew, based off everything that was going on in Europe with the Germans and in the Pacific with Japan, he was one of the very few Americans that actually predicted and was willing to go to war, and knew that more than likely the whole country was going to be involved in war at some point or another. So he figured, hey, without being drafted like my uncle did during the First World War, why don't I just go ahead and enlist and mentally and physically prepare myself to go to war with either major power that was going on at the time. So he stays in the National Guard for a couple of years, learning the basics and everything. And in 1940, he actually joined the U.S. Army Air Corps and would go on to enter gunnery school, basically how to use aircraft and their functions and all of that good stuff. Now, when it appeared that the U.S. would not enter World War II, Millet, with his very big urge to go ahead and fight, he would desert the U.S. military in mid-1941, along with a friend who also had a bad time in the military and had received a bad conduct discharge from the Marine Corps. They hitchhiked all the way up to Canada and enlisted in the Canadian Army. That's right, they went up north to enlist. Now, after they enlisted in the Canadian Army, Millet was assigned to the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery and ultimately sent to the United Kingdom, where he served as an anti-aircraft radar operator in London during the infamous Blitz campaign. Now, once the U.S. entered the war on December 7th, 1941, Millet decides to ultimately transfer back to the U.S. Army in 1942. Now, once he officially transfers back to the U.S. Army, his first assignment is to the 27th Armored Field Artillery Regiment of the 1st Armored Division, where he would serve in Tunisia as an anti-tank gunner during the famous Operation Torch that was led by Omar Bradley and General Patton. And it was during an engagement there, he was doing his thing, preparing his guns, loading it up or whatever. But while all this is going on, they are experiencing an artillery barrage by the Germans a long, long way. But little does he and his comrades know at first, but some lackluster soldiers at the time actually hidden a bunch of ammunition underneath some brush and some lumber, just in case they were overran or anything. The Germans could not use or find any ammunition and turned U.S. guns back on themselves. Well, anyway, Millet thought, oh, that is such a stupid idea. And what had ironically happened was one of those German artillery shells actually caught the pile of wood and brush that was covering the truck and ammunition that was on it. He actually caught the brush on fire, and Millet was like, oh damn, we got to get this out of here, otherwise we're all dead, we're done for, this is going to be really, really, really bad. So he sees this truck and the wood and the crates of ammunition is on fire. He doesn't hesitate one bit. In fact, he, in the middle of gunfire, he bolts onto the driver's side of that truck and drove that burning ammunition-filled half-track away from his fellow U.S. soldiers, jumping out of this flaming truck like this big, giant fireball. He jumps out of it just in the nick of time before the fire got to the ammunition, and the whole big truck exploded like a freaking torpedo. Man, it was a sight for sure. Dang, I don't know if anybody besides him would have many guts to do what he just did. That would terrify the piss and the hell out of me. Oof, but he didn't care. He was looking out for his men and whatever. Now, for this particular action of him driving away this burning half-track, He was ultimately awarded the U.S. military's third highest military honor for valor, the Silver Star Medal. And this, my friends, would be the start of a prolific Army career in his favor, and would prove to many others that he would do anything for the men beside him, for the men that he commanded underneath him. He doesn't mind getting in the mud and muck and whatever to help win a fight or whatever. And that persisted all the way through his Army career, especially in Korea, as we're about to see. After he was decorated for this incident in Tunisia, he later shot down a German airplane called a Bf-109 using half-track mounted machine guns. After these two incidents in North Africa, Millet was promoted to sergeant and would take part in the Allied invasion of Italy, where he fought in many different American battles on the Italian front, including the Battle of Sal Reno and the subsequent famous Battle of Anzio, among many other things. He would actually go on and serve in Italy for about a year and a half or whatever, and then his regiment would be called up to go fight the Germans in Europe, which he would participate in many different battles at that point, including the Battle of the Bulge, and ultimately would be stationed in Germany post-war for peace talks and everything else. Let's just say he was around the block or two and seen a lot of combat in World War II by itself, and he was a very experienced and combat-hardened veteran at this point. Now, whenever hostilities ended for World War II in 1945, he was awarded many different medals, obviously. So for his service during the Second World War, not only was Millet awarded a Silver Star Medal for that incident in North Africa, but he was also awarded a Bronze Star Medal, a Purple Heart Medal for various injuries he sustained, as well as the World War II Victory Medal, as well as the Middle Eastern, African, and European Theater Campaign Medals, along with many other decorations. So you would think, after serving in the greatest conflict of any generation at that point, you think, hey, I want to get out of the military, I want to live a normal life, I just want to kick back and relax. Well, Millet hesitated at first, but he ultimately decides to make a career out of the Army. Thus, he was transferred to the Army Reserves after World War II ended. During the interwar period after World War II ends, he would actually attend Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, for about 3 years until he was called back to active duty service whenever the Korean War breaks out in June of 1950. So immediately, once the U.S. is going to war with North Korea, he is among the first batch of U.S. Army soldiers that are sent overseas to serve in Korea. At first, he fought in the very earliest battles of the Korean conflict, including the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, where basically, at that particular point in the war, that was basically where the South Koreans had their back to the door and were almost pushed off the peninsula entirely. He was a part of the company that would defend the South Koreans until MacArthur would implement the famous Incheon landing, where U.S. Marines invaded Incheon and eventually took over the South Korean capital of Seoul. But anyway, that was a whole nother group. He was down there in the nitty-gritty with the 1st Army troops down there fighting off wave after wave of North Korean soldiers until they could get some relief to those guys. Yeah, it's pretty bad, y'all. I could not even begin to imagine. Well, fast forward a little bit. So after a few months, he again becomes a distinguished Army officer, and he was actually put in charge of various commands at some points or another during Korea. In fact, on December 5th, 1950, Captain Millet was flying as an observer in a Stinson L5 Sentinel whenever Captain JFO Davis, DFC, crashed his PF-51D Mustang in enemy territory in North Korea. Now, the pilot of that L5 landed on a road near the downed Mustang, where Millet courageously, he gave up his seat to the downed Captain Davis so that Davis could be medevaced and taken to safety or whatever. And there's no room left for him on the aircraft whatsoever to return to his men. Any insane person would be freaking out, but he basically says, look, there's no room for me. I'm just going to stay behind. I'm just going to hold off this enemy attack while you guys can come pick me up in a little bit. I'll be fine, trust me. Now, I can only imagine the look on the pilot's face whenever he told that to him or whatever, but nonetheless, that's what Millet does. He stays undercover and he holds off an enemy attack while this helicopter medevacts this pilot to safety. And he does this for a few hours. I mean, a small wave after small wave of North Korean and Chinese soldiers coming after you. He was practically acting like a one-man army at this point. So for a few hours, the pilot, after dropping off an injured Captain Davis, he was scouring the skies over that part of North Korea to see if he could see Millet anywhere. But of course, there was so much smoke and gunfire, you couldn't tell who was who or whatever. This continued most of the day, by the way. And it was only by sheer luck that just before dark, the L5 that Millet was riding in returned, found him, and ultimately picked him up. Now, for his bravery in this particular action, Miller was awarded a Purple Heart, an Air Medal, as well as the U.S. Army's second highest military medal for bravery, the Distinguished Service Cross, for his selfless actions during that particular day. He was becoming an even more renowned soldier in the heat of battle at this point. Like, he is like top to the top dog, and he's willing to do anything for his men. But oh no, he's not done in Korea either, because his finest moment is just about to happen a couple of months later on February 7th, 1951. Now, it was on that day where Millet was serving in South Korea as a captain and commander of Company E of the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army. And it was on this day near the town of Somni where he would lead his company in an all-out assault on an enemy position atop Hill 180 near the town of Songtan. Whenever one battalion became pinned down by heavy fire, Millet took another platoon forward and joined the two groups in leading them up this Hill 180 to take it or whatever. Now, it was during this heavy machine gun and artillery fire where he riles all of his men and everything. And he basically says, to hell with it, guys. We're about out of ammunition or whatever. Fix any bayonet and knife that you have on you and put it on top of your rifle. We're about to get greasy, boys. We're about to go into a bunch of severe hand-to-hand combat. Now, with his men and him wielding his bayonet and throwing hand grenades, Millet led a charge up this hill, bayonets and all, his men are practically out of ammunition. I mean, this is like Hollywood shit right here. Like, everybody is just going at it slow motion, like, oh, come get me, boy. They're all just going at it bare-knuckled and knives against these North Koreans and Chinese soldiers. Now, while all this is going on, of course, Millet has his bayonet M1 Garand or M1 carbine rifle, whatever he was issued at that time. And as he's shouting orders and all this, he's throwing hand grenades at the enemy to keep them stirred up. I mean, it's like a madhouse on the side of this hill. Now, upon reaching the top of the hill, his men under his leadership stormed the enemy position and forced the opposing soldiers to withdraw entirely. And although wounded in the shin by various grenade fragments, Millet refused to be evacuated until the entirety of the position on Hill 180 was secured. So, it was for his bold leadership during the assault of Hill 180 that Captain Millet was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is highly deserved and considered the highest military honor that any military member can receive in his or her career. The Medal of Honor was formally presented to him by President Harry S. Truman in July of 1951, a mere 5 months after that famous bayonet charge. Now, he would remain in the Army for the remainder of the Korean War until the services and the hostilities ended in July of 1953. So, in total, for his service in the Korean War, Captain Millet was awarded not only the Medal of Honor, but his other medals include, of course, the Army Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, a 2nd Bronze Star Medal, a Legion of Merit, as well as other various medals like the Korean Service Medal. At this point, he is a very, very highly decorated military officer, and he had a lot of prestige by his name. And while he was very happy that he was awarded all these honors and everything, his main focus was to be in the mud in the trenches and whatever with his men, to rally them and to get an objective done or whatever. I mean, he was a very selfless individual. So, after hostilities end in 1953, Millet again decides to stay in the U.S. Army. And it was during the period of the early 1950s through the mid-1960s that Millet would receive a new assignment, in that he was destined to become a U.S. Army Ranger. In fact, he would go on to attend the Ranger School at Fort Moore, Georgia, where he was ultimately assigned to the famous 101st Airborne Division as an intelligence officer, who later would go on to serve 4 or 5 tours of duty in Vietnam as a military advisor to the controversial Phoenix program, which aimed to root out and kill all Viet Cong sympathizers. While at the 101st Airborne in 1959, he became the commander of the 1st Recondo, or Reconnaissance Commando School, which was responsible for training NCOs in small unit tactics and patrolling skills. And between his tours of duty in Vietnam during the mid-60s, he actually commanded the Army Security Agency Training Center at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Now, at this point, he's a very comfortable, prestigious officer in the Army, and life is great for him. In fact, Miller would remain in the military until the 1970s, where he ultimately retired in 1973 with the rank of colonel. Now, he later stated that he retired because he felt the U.S. had, quote, quit in Vietnam. Now, for his service in that particular conflict, Millet was awarded a number of other medals too. And among those was his third and final Bronze Star Medal, his final Purple Heart, a second Legion of Merit Medal, along with 2 more air medals for airdrops in Vietnam with his regiment in the 101st, among many other campaign and U.S. military decorations. So, as you can see, y'all, Millet was a very, very well-respected, albeit not so known individual on the world stage per se, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a very good soldier. In fact, he was one of the finest. So, as a brief summary for all of those service medals that he's received in his 33-long Army career, which spans from World War II, Korea, as well as Vietnam, they include the following: the Medal of Honor, the Army Distinguished Service Cross, a Silver Star Medal, 2 Legions of Merit, 3 Bronze Stars, 4 Purple Hearts, 3 Air Medals, the Army Good Conduct Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, as well as various U.S. campaign medals, which include the European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 7 service stars, the World War II Victory Medal, the Korean Service Medal with 5 service stars, as well as the Vietnam War Service Medal with 5 service stars, among many other decorations. After his military career, Millet served as a deputy sheriff in Trenton, Tennessee, where he would reside for a little bit of his life. And he eventually moved to Idlewood, California, where he would remain for the rest of his retirement. And he actually regularly appeared at celebrity events that celebrated veterans, both in the Riverside County area and anywhere else around the country. In fact, he was a member of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society and the California Commandery of the Military Order of Foreign Wars, among other organizations. Now, sadly, Millet would pass away from congestive heart failure on November 14th, 2009, 1 month short of his 89th birthday. That was a very interesting story, and I just gotta say it. He was a badass on 3 different battlefields and 3 different conflicts in our nation's history. Of course, his service in World War II is iconic because that's the greatest conflict that America and people have served in. I personally think his service in Korea was even more impressive because that was in his prime and he was becoming more of an influence and a very highly respected and renowned officer at that point. I couldn't imagine one voluntarily staying behind enemy lines to fend off an attack against Chinese and North Korean soldiers like he did in 1950 for a few hours until someone could come pick him up. And then on top of it, to lead an American unit, like a whole American Army unit, in a bayonet charge against all the enemy on this very steep hill, man, that took a lot of guts in itself, and I just could not even begin to imagine. So I think it's safe to say why I personally consider him one of the more badass people to serve in Korea, because Korea was a very different environment compared to what the U.S. and other people were used to at that point in time. It was frozen tundra for a lot of it, and it was very hilly, and it was very, very unpredictable weather-wise. And this was among the first wars to really, really use guerrilla tactics like the Chinese and the North Koreans used. So his feats in the middle of battle like this are very impressive, to say the least. In fact, this video going forward is dedicated to all of our Korean War veterans out there. Thank you so much for your boundless sacrifice and your wonderful service. It doesn't go unnoticed. Well, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this inspiring story, and please leave a like and subscribe. I would really, really appreciate the support, you guys, and stick around for next time, where we will be talking about the most decorated Air Force pilot to serve in the Korean conflict. Thank you guys, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.